The Beholder is probably the most iconic original Dungeons & Dragons monster ever, and it's been there since the start of the game. And it's kind of disappointing we haven't had any decent Beholder miniatures up until now. Finally, we have some official miniatures by WizKids for Wizards of the Coast D&D game, and they finally came out with a decent looking Beholder. It's beautiful too. Had to do some work on it to fix it up a little bit better though. These figures are all pre-assembled, but they are multiple parts, so some of the areas weren't glued that very well. I had to fill in some gaps. Seam lines, of course, were prevalent, and also I decided to replace the big, thick, clear base and replace that with a rod, and I made a nice treasure base for him. So after all that was done, we primed with black, and we're going to go ahead and start with our color. I actually researched, I could not find a color scheme, ecology for Beholders. Most of the artwork tends to have them red or pink, but they do come in other colors, but I couldn't find any official word about what colors Beholders are in. So I decided to go for, well, sort of a bluish purple. I went into this project not knowing exactly what I wanted, which usually doesn't work out for me. It's best if I go in with the plan, but I didn't do it this time. We are starting off with Stormy Blue from the game's, the Vallejo game color range. Since I didn't know exactly what I wanted, I decided to play around and kind of hope the colors I picked would work out. So rather than just simply adding a lighter or medium blue, I actually added Vallejo game color Escorpena Green to our Stormy Blue and just gave it a heavy dry brush. For our next highlight, I am adding Vallejo model color Beige. Because I have an odd color mix here, the blue mixing with the very light green, I don't want to add more of the light green because that's going to turn everything, well, green. I kind of want to keep it the shade that I have going. So that's why we're going with a more neutral color of the beige. So this just gets dry brush very heavily at this point. Again, I was trying to figure things out while I was painting the figures, so you can see here I'm doing pretty heavy dry brush because I decided to lighten up the whole figure at this point. So the previous dry brush is getting mostly covered. Following that dry brush, I did a second one with a bit more of the green and beige added to it. And now we're proceeding to add some of the final highlights here. I mixed in a little bit of white because, again, I've kind of boxed myself in. Don't want to go too far beige or too far green. So the white, completely neutral, and just highlighting the upper edges of the scales. For the fleshy bits like the eye stalks, I base coated with game color Royal Purple, and to highlight that I've added once again Escorpena Green and Beige. I'm going with the same highlight colors because I don't want the stalks or the mouth area to stand out drastically from the colors that I used on the scale portions. I kind of want them to look like they come from the same creature. So I don't want to do anything like paint the body blue and then have the eye stalks red because that's going to look very odd. Next highlight applied with a bit more precision with a regular brush, and I've added a bit more beige to our previous mixture. A very small color palette we're using so far, so hopefully everything will look, slightly different but still be more cohesive when we get to the end. The stalks and the scales were still looking a bit too out of place, not cohesive enough, so I decided to add a little bit of purple to the blue on the scales, and for that I'm using a mix of, it's Royal Purple, got it thinned very well, and I've added some Glaze medium to it, which softens the color. So applying that very heavily, and it's gonna, once it dries, because of the glaze medium, the color is gonna tone down quite a bit. So applied, I think I did about 2 washes total of this, and doing my best just to keep it in the recesses, not on the ends of all the little scale bits. So it's a subtle color shift. Hopefully that's noticeable only if you look very close. Now on to the big scales. We could paint these the exact same way we did the small scales, but that's a little boring. So I want to paint them differently, but not as so differently that they end up sticking out like a sore thumb. So kind of like what we did with the STALKS, where you need to have a subtle color transition so it still blends in to the rest of the beholder. To that effect, I've already painted them with the colors that I used on the regular scales, and I'm doing a kind of heavy wash of Stormy Blue right now, just to get a nice slight color change on them. To highlight the big scales, you probably already know what 2 colors I'm using here. Yes, that's right, Escorpena Green and Beige added to the Stormy Blue. So by using those same colors, we have a nice cohesion throughout the whole model. I've actually already skipped a couple of the highlight steps here just so I don't get repetitive. At this point, I'm actually highlighting the tips using just Escorpena Green and Beige. And then we finally tie everything together, once again using our Royal Purple wash, the same that we did on the body. So as the large scales get closer to the center of the body, they pick up that same color. On to the mouth. For that, I have base coated with, once again, Royal Purple. And highlighting over that, just a slight difference in color here. We are using Gain Color Hexed Lichen. Virtually the same color, just has a little bit more of a pink tinge to it. To our Hexed Lichen, I've now added some Warlord Purple, which has a lot of pink in it, to proceed with the highlights here. Of course, once again, trying to keep everything fairly monotone here. Could go with, a bright pink mouth, but that's going to stand out too much from our other colors. So keeping everything subtle, kind of a sepia tone thing in color going on here, if you get my drift. And for our final highlight, I've now added some model color basic skin tone. Very nice flesh color that works very well blended in with our Warlord Purple. Now on to the tiny eyes. I decided to paint them all different colors, so I'm not going to go through everything here. The basics is base coated the eyeball itself with some model color pale sand. We do a dot of black, let that dry, and then we take our various colors here of the rainbow and do a nice big glob in the black, center of the black, so we leave a nice slight edge of black around the edges. Next, we highlight each eye with whatever appropriate color, either by adding yellow or white to the base color, and proceeding to draw kind of like a star in the center of each eye. So a crisscross X and a line going up and down. Next, we make a tiny drop of white in the upper left-hand corner of each eyeball. This is to recreate the idea of the sun reflecting off the clear eye. So we're doing in the upper left. If some of the eyes are looking in different directions, that may change exactly where the spot of white goes. So if there was, for example, an eye looking backwards, we do it on the right side. So the white is, according to wherever the sun is, the white spot is all on the same side. And then finally, small spot of black, direct center of the eye, touching the white area as well. And that finishes up our eyeballs. On to the teeth, and he's got a lot of them. They're so prominent, we got to use very fine, thin layers here and go very subtle with our color transitions. I base coated them with model colors golden brown mixed with English uniform. Most of that was covered up though because I decided to go a little bit lighter, so I just left it at the base of the teeth. Now I am going over that with English uniform mixed with beige. After a couple thin coats, working our way up to straight beige, I'm now working with beige mixed with pale sand. After some very thin coats of that mixture, now it's time for some very thin coats of pale sand. My color transition was still a little bit rough, so I decided to cover everything with two glazes. A first glaze of pale sand, very, very thin, basically just colored water applied over each tooth a couple times. And then I followed that up with a glaze of game colored desert yellow. And that color I concentrated more on the base of the teeth, so he's got some plaque built up. So the last thing to do is the main eye, and boy, I made a mess out of this. This model has the unusual characteristic of the eye is actually, or the iris is concaved, and they give you a clear piece that goes over that. After thinking about it and looking online, I decided I didn't like that look, so I just glued the clear piece in place and I was going to paint that as the eyeball. Unfortunately, after thinking about it for a while, I realized it was sticking out too far. So I tried some fixes, I couldn't think of anything. The only thing I could think of was to rip out the clear piece and then putty in a new eye with green stuff. That did pose a few issues because mainly I didn't want to get putty all over the areas I already painted, but it's what I had to do because I like to make things difficult. Anyway, after getting that all in place, painting our eye, once again, use beige and then highlight up to pale sand, and I actually added a little bit white as well. Just like the smaller eyes, we start with a big black circle, highlighted that with a Vallejo Model Color deep green mixed with black, and now we're using straight deep green to do our little star pattern. A little bit more complex on this one. For our second highlight, I've mixed in some flat white and some park green, and just continuing our little line pattern here. You can see like it's kind of like how I did the star on the smaller eyes, but much more complex. And as we continue on the highlights, you're going to see we're going to get closer and closer towards the center of the eye. After a few more highlights, working our way towards yellow, we can finish up by adding the pupil, just like we did before, but because this is a much larger eye, went ahead and made a long slit rather than just a dot. After getting the pupil in position, I know exactly where the center of my eye is now, and so I can do the final highlight on the colored area of the eye. And for that, I'm using just straight flat yellow and kind of just doing it in dots, so it continues with the broken pattern that we have with the lines going into the eye. And then we finish off with our little dot of white for the reflective look. And this was a little bit, I wasn't too sure if this was correct or not. If I gloss coat this, which I wasn't sure at this point, the larger the object is, the more it's going to reflect if you gloss it. So this little dot of white may actually be fighting the sheen from the gloss that I may put on it later. The eye is pretty much done, but I decided that I went a little bit too white with it. So decided to add a little bit color, a little bit of shade by putting on some glazes using model color yellow ochre. And there's about 4 coats of this glaze, just slowly building up some color in the recessed areas of the eye. Once that was dry, I went ahead and added one more glaze, this time using model color flat red. Just add a little bit of redness to the eye. Beholders, they don't sleep well. And then to add a little bit more red into the eye, using that same flat red and a kind of ruined brush, and kind of doing a stippling dry brush around the eyes to highlight the veins just a little bit more. The model has been flat varnished now, and now I'm going back and adding some gloss. Now, I'm not a huge fan of adding gloss to models. The whole point of highlighting and shading is to recreate the shade and highlights caused by the sun, and when you put a gloss coat over it, that's fighting the highlights that you already placed. However, this guy is all eyes and teeth, so I thought some gloss should be necessary. Decided not to overdo it. First started off with a satin on all the teeth and the eyes, and after a couple coats of that, I decided that the eye, especially the main eye, really did need a bit more gloss, so I went over that with a regular full gloss varnish, about 4 or 5 coats actually, so we get a nice good coverage on the main eyeball. Now, this beholder is obviously a copy of the one on the current Monster manual, and so I decided to add a little bit extra touch here and add some drool. I've read about using epoxy glue as drool. I had to experiment because I didn't know exactly how to apply it. Finally figured out that if you glue some hair to the teeth first and then cover it with epoxy glue, you get a nice drool effect. I won't tell you where I got the hair from. And there we go, we are done with our beholder. And finally, after so many years of waiting, I finally have a decent, officially licensed beholder figure, and it looks awesome. Been waiting for this for years, seriously. Monotone color came out pretty well. Again, when I go into something and I don't have a plan, it usually doesn't work, but it kind of worked here. Kind of the pastel colors kind of just blended together and everything managed to click. Definitely would like to do another one of these in a closer, more traditional red color. The eyeball choice, I'm glad I replaced the one that was in with the kit because the clear plastic isn't very clear. And also by resculpting the eye, that allowed me to paint the eyeball much bigger. So overall, yeah, it's pretty decent. I haven't had a huge amount of luck with the WizKids figures. The sculpting on them, a lot of them are questionable. This one, the sculpting's really nice. The only issue is the assembly. There were some gaps that need filling, plenty of seam lines, of course. And I'm not a big fan of the clear parts, but if you are, this piece comes with separate tentacles that have little clear spell effects on them, and also there's the big clear flight stand, which I think is excessively huge. That's why I replaced it. But so if you like those little baubles, you can pull out the eyes and then replace them with the other spell effect eyes if you choose. So there you go. There is a beholder, and all I need is a party now to unleash it upon. Thanks for watching.
Watch out for snakes.